Today. And again, just give people an idea of what our workshops have been going on for many, many years. And the reason we have workshops is in part because there's so many different things that parenting involves that most of us have not had formal education about. Despite many years in high school, college, or even grad school, myself, I've never had really any formal education on many of the things that we've talked about in our parenting workshops, and this one in particular, and that is sleep. So it's a very valuable thing to be able to have an opportunity to talk about these things, because being a parent is probably, it's the most important thing that I've ever done, and it's probably the same for most of us. So today, I'm very, very pleased to introduce a friend and colleague, Dr. Wendy Chabot. Dr. Chabot has a long career and a wonderful career involving many different things. She actually, many people do not know that she's worked at Northampton Area Pediatrics for many years, off and on. In fact, she predates me as well. She also has worked at Amherst Pediatrics, and most recently, she's developed a real specialty in sleep medicine. And as she's worked at the Atkins family practice for several years, and now has developed her own private practice in helping parents and children with very important problems of dealing with sleep. So I would like to introduce Dr. Chabot. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, sure, John. It's really great to be here. And I love talking about sleep and sharing about sleep, because like you, I really did not learn about sleep at all, or very little in medical school, residency. And early in my career, I remember Dr. Ferber published a book, and then I got that, and that was about all I knew about sleep. But the field has really exploded in the last many years in terms of PD sleep, but adult sleep as well. And it's actually a really exciting field. So I'm always delighted to have the opportunity to share, because I'm pretty passionate about sleep and what I've learned, and happy to share. So anyways, we will stop periodically for questions. So probably every couple of slides, here we go. We'll take a little pause. And if you have a question, we'll answer it at that time. You can put questions into the chat room for John. And as John mentioned, if it feels like it's just too personal, you don't want it to be part of the recording, we completely understand. And I'm happy to, we'll stop the recording at the very end, and then have Q&A that won't be recorded. But just in terms of what to expect over the next bit of time, I'd like to talk briefly, first of all, about the function of sleep, different sleep stages, what controls sleep, and then what are the consequences of not having enough sleep. And then we'll move on to speak more specifically about infants and toddlers, what their sleep needs are, how to promote healthy sleep, and some approaches to potential problems. That will probably come up a little bit more in the Q&A. And perhaps folks that are present could type into John and just let him know how old their children are that bring them to this presentation, because since it's a small group, I can really tailor my comments to the relevant age groups. So, Sleep 101. As many of you may know, there's two different types of sleep. So there's deep sleep, and then there's also REM, rapid eye movement sleep. And I like to think of deep sleep as being really important for the body, and then REM, or rapid eye movement sleep, being really important for the mind. Deep sleep is further subdivided into 3 stages, cleverly called N1, N2, and 3. I should say deep sleep is also known as non-REM sleep, so NREM sleep, hence the N1, N2, and 3. N1 is a very light stage of sleep, easy to wake somebody up from. N2 is intermediate. And then N3 is that really, really deep stage of sleep where maybe your child's fallen asleep in the car, you carry them into the car seat, you put them into the crib, they don't wake up. You know, you're able to get them in their PJs. That's somebody who's in deep N3 sleep. So this type of sleep is really important for growth and development, and it's actually when kids grow. So early in the course of the evening, there'll be a surge in growth hormone, and it's in response to growth hormone that long bones get longer. And I have a recollection of putting one of my kids to bed at night and then going in the morning and thinking, you grew last night. This was, 35 years ago. And it turns out it was true that, they really do grow overnight when they're sleeping. It's thought that this might be why some people will have more teething discomfort because the teeth are growing in response to a surge in growth hormone. But anyways, for those of us that are no longer growing linearly, this type of sleep is when we're going to repair our tissues. So you cut yourself gardening or sprain your ankle, or you just have a really vigorous workout, or your child ran around an extra bit today or whatever on a beautiful summer day. It's during this type of sleep, non-REM sleep, that the tissues are going to repair. Lots of immune function going on during this stage of sleep. And I can refer anyone who's interested to a presentation that Charles Slicer just gave on sleep and immune function. He's the head of sleep at Harvard, and it was just fascinating. But we've learned that actually with the COVID pandemic, that short sleep or disruptive sleep was an independent risk factor for poor outcomes. And it just goes to speak to the importance of sleep for our immune system. Lots of immune activity going on overnight. Hormone regulation. So I touched on growth hormone, but also hormones related to insulin and glucose metabolism. And this is thought to be one of the ways that short sleep might relate to obesity. During a non-REM or deep sleep, we're also restoring energy reserves. Recently, we've learned that during deep sleep, neurotoxins such as amyloid are flushed from the brain. And as you may know, that if over years and years and years, decades, if amyloid builds up, that's thought to be a precursor of Alzheimer's dementia. And then non-REM and deep sleep also have a role in learning, more procedural and motor type learning, but also transfer of newly learned material from one part of the brain to another so that it can be dealt with during REM sleep. So REM is rapid eye movement sleep. It's when most of our dreaming occurs. And REM sleep is really important for learning, for memory, for ability to pay attention and to concentrate, problem solving, coping, creativity. I recently heard a podcast with Paul McCartney where he talked about writing Let It Be, waking up from a dream, and Mother Mary came to me. And he got up from the dream and then wrote Let It Be. But I think most of us aren't writing music, especially Paul McCartney quality music, but many of us have had the experience of not being able to cope or problem solve, right, when we're short on sleep. And I understand that every culture has an expression for, well, why don't you sleep on it? Because it's just intuitively known that sleep helps us with coping and problem solving. Universally, sleep is very important for our mood. And, if we aren't getting good quality sleep, then we're going to be irritable, we're going to be crabby. This is true for infants and toddlers as it is for adults. And then also during REM sleep is very important for brain growth and for making neural connections. So it's during REM sleep that new connections in the brain are formed and strengthened, and ones that are perhaps no longer necessary are pruned. So these are really, really essential parts of our physical and mental well-being. And I think, over decades, our culture hasn't quite appreciated, right, the importance of sleep. And I don't know any one of us that wants to sell ourselves short, really, in these areas. This is an important slide, and we'll spend a couple minutes talking about it. But so the different was in the 1950s or so that the EEG, or electroencephalogram, was developed. And when it came into more common use, that's when the field of sleep medicine really started to take off, because that was when folks were able to discern that sleep wasn't just the absence of being awake. So these different sleep stages that we were just referring to have different EEG patterns. So when one is awake, your brain waves look like this in a quiet, alert, relaxed state. And then as you fall from N1 to N2 to N3 sleep, so light sleep, medium to the deep sleep, your brain waves change in this pattern. So this is what N3 looks like. This is what N2 looks like, that intermediate stage of sleep. These sleep spindles are thought to represent transfer of newly acquired information, kind of like downloading a USB onto the hard drive. And then here, this is the stage that's the most restorative, N3, or deep sleep. It's also called slow wave sleep because the brain waves are so slow. This is a very, very quiet time for the brain and a really busy time for the body, all that maintenance and repair going on in the body. And then finally, this is what our brain waves look like when we're in REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. And I think it's pretty easy to see that REM more closely resembles being awake or in a light stage of sleep than it does being in deep or slow wave sleep. And that's because this is a really busy time for the brain. It's a very quiet time for the body, but it's a really busy time for the brain. And throughout the course of the night, we cycle through these stages many times. So looking on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see that we start out awake, then we have some deep sleep, then we have REM, then we have deep, then we have REM, then we have deep. And in adults, we cycle through these stages about every 90 to 110 minutes. We'll talk about how things are different in infants in a minute. But one of the most important things to know about this is that, well, we get most of our deep sleep in the first part of the night. That's thought because it's the most important and restorative. And then we get most of our dreaming sleep in the second part of the night. And every time we come out of a cycle, at the end of every cycle, and unfortunately it isn't well demonstrated, or it isn't demonstrated on this slide, but every time we end a cycle, we wake up. So all of us wake overnight, adults about every 90 to 110 minutes, babies probably more like 50 to 75 minutes. It's 50 minutes as a brand newborn, and then it gets longer. The cycles get longer and longer as a child develops. Typically, the cycles are about a 90-minute cycle by a child starts kindergarten or early grade school years. So important to know, waking overnight is normal, normal, normal. And for most of us, it's just a brief arousal. And it might be 30 seconds, it might be a minute or two long, but it's not long enough that we even form a memory of it. So, you wake up in the morning and you feel like, oh, I had a great night's sleep, I slept through. But actually, all of us wake at night. And a perfect world, you fluff the pillow, you adjust your covers, and you surrender back to deep sleep. You don't look at the clock. You don't let the thinking horse out of the barn and start worrying, because then you're likely to take a short normal arousal and turn it into something more problematic. So let's see. This is a slide I just put up from Up to Date, and it's a little busy, but what I liked about it was, so this is that hypnogram again. So here's awake. Here the REM is in red. You can see the REM is more towards the morning. Stage N3, the deep sleep, more at the beginning of the night. But what is nice about this slide is it does show the normal, normal arousals overnight. Waking many times overnight is normal. This can also be helpful in older children, just as an aside. Things like confusional arousals or sleep terrors, those are phenomena that come out of deep sleep, so they're going to happen more at the beginning of the night. versus nightmares, which come out of REM sleep. They're going to happen more at the end of the night. So here, this is I'm sorry this slide is a little bit hard to see, but I think it illustrates how sleep architecture changes over the first several months to years of life. So here's a 1-week-old infant. Look at all this REM, right? The REM here is in blue. So lots of REM sleep. And just think of it, learning, right? Making sense of the world. Newborns have to do quite a bit of that. And then 6 months old, I think it's easy to see how the cycles are starting to get longer. And then compared to here, a child, the school-age child, having much longer cycles and really more closely resembling a young adult. And another thing that's interesting, it's different with brand newborns, and this changes by a few months of age. But as we were discussing, older infants and then children and adults start being awake and then having N1, N2, and N3 sleep. Newborns, on the other hand, go right into REM. So the beginning of their sleep cycle starts with REM. And so it isn't unusual to see like a little bit of facial twitching or eye movements, a little bit of lip smacking as somebody is starting to go into REM sleep. And this can sometimes be concerning for parents, but it's normal. But by 6 months of age, they're having starting sleep with deep sleep and then having REM. But what the main point of looking at this slide is just to point out that the shorter cycles in a newborn and in an infant compared to a child lead to the opportunities for more overnight awakenings. And infants that learn how to self-soothe will fall back to sleep on their own. And then signalers are those infants and children that signal for intervention. More on that later. This is just another slide that shows how sleep changes with age. So over here is a 1 to 15-day-old, and then way over here is the 70 to 85-year-old. And you can see several things, right? Sleep duration is much less as we get older, but the percentage of REM sleep decreases with age, and also the percentage of deep sleep decreases with age. So just to touch base briefly on the consequences of insufficient sleep, and then we'll take a little bit of a timeout if there's questions, otherwise I can just keep going. But what we've learned about not having enough sleep, and I like to spend a moment talking about this just because I think it's really important. Sometimes helping your child learn how to fall asleep or to return to sleep is difficult, right? Learning anything is difficult. And I'd really like to inspire parents and caregivers to know why it's so important that we do encourage our children to learn good sleep habits and behaviors. But anyways, we know that insufficient sleep is a real risk for mood disturbances. For kids that aren't getting enough sleep are going to have fatigue and sleepiness and lethargy during the day. We've learned that not having enough sleep is going to lead to more headaches, muscle aches, and increased pain during the day. Most definitely cognitive impairment. So problems with memory, learning, attention, concentration, decision-making, and problem solving. All of these areas can be impacted by insufficient sleep or not good quality sleep, because sleep has the duration element, but also quality element. And indeed, toddlers, or I should say school-age children, if they aren't getting enough sleep, can look like they have ADHD. And I like to point that out because unlike adults that will look sleepy and yawn a lot, and maybe fall, nod off, young toddlers and school-age kids are going to be more irritable. They're going to be hyperactive. They're going to have problems paying attention and learning. And before you know it, they've just gotten diagnosed with ADHD, right? So we all have to be on the lookout, before an ADHD diagnosis is made, to really be sure that somebody's sleeping well. But also daytime behavior problems. So temper tantrums. This is what you're going to see in a toddler, right? Their temper tantrums are part of being a toddler. But if your toddler is tantruming a lot, then really important to pay attention to sleep along with other aspects of their life. We also know that decreased sleep or insufficient sleep is going to decrease your coordination, increases risk-taking behaviors, particularly in adolescence, academic problems, and then with teenagers, they can start getting into caffeine and nicotine. And then finally, just to touch bases on some of the medical things associated with insufficient sleep, we do know that if folks aren't getting enough sleep and they're prone to having an elevated BMI, insufficient sleep is going to worsen that. It's been associated with type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, including hypertension, impaired immune function, and then increased cancer risk. We know this from nurses largely that work on the night shift. And this might be related to insufficient sleep, but also circadian rhythm disruption. Well, maybe I'll just do these next two slides. Are there questions yet, John? No, I can't hear you. Keep going. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Yes, I'm just going to remind people, you feel free to chat any questions you might have, and then I can ask Dr. Chabot that as they come in.
Great. Thanks. So, and John, did you hear how old the children are?
Yes, I did. Yes, thank you. So a range of between as low as 4 months old.
Okay.
So maybe that's maybe about not only just sleeping now, but what you might, be able to do to help develop good sleep habits.
Perfect.
And then the others are up to 5 years old. And most of them are in the toddler age. So, and those, I imagine people will have questions about how you get them to sleep through the night. I mean, it might have problems now, but I'm guessing.
Okay, so that's helpful. I will spend a minute on this slide then, especially because this will be relevant. But anyways, there's a few things that we know from a physiologic point of view control sleep. One is this thing called sleep drive, and then the other is what's called the biological clock. So this is a little bit less relevant for infants, but it's going to be important for the toddlers and school-age kids. But anyway, so here's the, in this graphic, we're thinking about the quintessential adult 8-hour sleeper, okay? So they get up at 7 in the morning, they get the kids to school, they go to work, they get the kids after school, they do all the things that they do. They're busy for 16 hours. And throughout that 16-hour period, they're building up this thing called sleep drive or sleep juice, or the need for sleep, right? The longer you're awake, the stronger your need for sleep becomes. And then hopefully you fall asleep, you have a good night's sleep. You're going to wake up, but you're not going to remember it. But sleep drive helps one fall asleep and stay asleep. And it's mediated by a chemical that builds up in the brain called adenosine. So adenosine is a byproduct of ATP metabolism. And when it builds up in the brain, because our brains have been busy, we get sleepy. So that's that feeling that we have as adults of eyelids are heavy, head nodding, like, you're rereading the same line in a book a few times and it isn't sinking in. That's because adenosine is built up in the brain. It builds up slowly during the day, but then with sleep, it's rapidly cleared. So this is one of the restorative functions of sleep. Things to know about adenosine is, caffeine is an adenosine antagonist. It blocks the effects of adenosine. So that's how caffeine might keep you up at night. And it sticks around. The half-life of caffeine is anywhere from 6 to 8 hours long. So caffeine, particularly later in the day, is going to have a big impact on sleep. And I like to point out too that caffeine does get into breast milk. So if an infant is having difficulties falling asleep at night, staying asleep, or is just irritable or jittery during the day, it can be helpful for a breastfeeding mom to look at their caffeine intake and be sure that they're limiting it, certainly later in the day. Um, so another thing to say about sleep drive is one of the best things to improve sleep drive is exercise and activity, right? There's just nothing like being active to improve your sleep drive. And we've all experienced this, right? You go for a really long bike ride, a longer than usual run, just yard work, whatever, right? You just know that you're gonna sleep better that night. And then naps, you can think of as a sleep snack. So, for adults, napping can be a problem later in the day, but this can also be a problem for toddlers. The classic challenge I see is the toddler that's been at daycare, and they have longer naps during the week than they have on the weekends at home, or they fall asleep on the way home from daycare, right? They get a 1 hour nap from 5 to 6, and then it's really hard for them to fall asleep at night. So sleep drive, a nap is going to use up a lot of sleep drive, particularly towards the end of the day. And if there's questions about that, we can talk about it more later. So sleep drive mediated by adenosine, caffeine can be a problem. Be aware of all the sources of caffeine, right? Coffee, teas, sodas, chocolate. Avoid dark chocolate at night. Chocolate for breakfast is fine. And then exercise good, and then napping, particularly later in the day, can be problematic when it comes to sleep onset at night. Another thing that is responsible for influencing or controlling sleep from a physiologic point of view is this thing called the biological clock. So this is a bunch of brain cells. I've heard it quoted to be 20 to 50,000 brain cells that's responsible for the timing of when sleep is most likely to happen. So you have to have built up enough sleep drive, but then for one to be able to fall asleep, it needs to coincide with the time of day when your clock is giving you permission to fall asleep. Now, this changes over the course of a lifetime. As we know, younger children tend to be larks, right? And then with adolescence, there is a physiologic shift in the biological clock for them to become more night owls. And that can last into the 20s. And then many people will shift back to being more morning type or type-ish in their later 20s. And the clock, as you may know, exerts its effect through secreting melatonin, also known as the sleep hormone or hormone of darkness. So here's a graphic that just illustrates the relationship between melatonin and sleep period. So here again is the quintessential adult sleeper, 11 to 7. Here's melatonin level, sleep propensity, and core body temperature. The higher your body temperature, the more alert you are. Lower body temperature, less alert. So here's melatonin turned off during the day in response to light. And then pre-Tim Cook, pre-Thomas Edison, our world used to get dark. And if you can imagine that, the world used to get dark at night. And in response to darkness, melatonin is produced and released. It's the only hormone, I believe the only hormone in the body that isn't produced and then stored for later use. It's actually produced kind of on demand in response to darkness. Hence, it's really important that we let our world get dark at night so that our melatonin level can naturally rise. And assuming we're staying in a dark environment, we'll maintain a robust melatonin level overnight. And then in the morning, we get light exposure, and that turns off our melatonin. So things to just say about this. Important to let your world grow dark at night and the world of your children to grow darker and dimmer at night. good to be off screens, in that hour or so before bedtime because of the potential effects of screens on melatonin, but also the content is often activating. Best sleep environment, cool, dark, quiet, safe. You need your body temperature to drop to be able to have a good night's sleep. So a cooler environment is better for sleep. But then having a dark sleep environment is good. And I really encourage folks not to get their kids accustomed to night lights, and certainly not have them learning how to fall asleep with a television or a screen, because especially having something on overnight can really interrupt melatonin. And the most important part of setting the clock is the wake time. So this whole field of circadian medicine is really taking off and is as equally important and interesting to me as the field of sleep medicine. But we're learning that every cell in our body has a circadian rhythm. I just think that's astonishing, right? Like our heart cells want to do certain things at certain times. Our digestive cells want to do certain things at certain times, right? The daytime is the time to eat and digest, and then the nighttime is the time our intestines can heal and recover. So every cell in the body has a circadian rhythm. And to maximize circadian health, the best thing any of us can do for ourselves and our kids is to have a set wake time, because that's what sets the whole clock in motion. People will often try to fix sleep difficulties by going to bed earlier, but you can't. You can't force sleep. Sleep is a surrender. You can't force it, but you can get up earlier, and that's going to make it easier to fall asleep at an earlier time. And folks often will ask about melatonin, so I preemptively put this slide in. I haven't finished it yet because I didn't write the source. This is from Up to Date, and it's from Judith Owens, who, as you may know, is the head of PD sleep medicine at Children's, and is really one of just one of my heroines. But anyways, melatonin is naturally occurring. It's secreted and released by the pineal gland. And there is evidence that giving melatonin as a supplement can help for certain populations. So particularly kids with ADHD or kids with neurodevelopmental challenges, such as those on the autistic spectrum. The other pros are it doesn't seem to affect sleep architecture. It has a low side effect profile. It's generally well tolerated. Some people will have nightmares, headaches, next day sleepiness. It's generally widely available, and there's PD-friendly preparations. The downside of thinking of melatonin use to help with sleep in children is we really do not have any information about long-term side effects. So we just don't know it. And I don't recommend, unless the child has ADHD or is on the spectrum, I do not recommend long-term use of melatonin. The dosing and timing are crucial. Melatonin is interesting. It's both a hypnotic for some people, meaning it helps you fall asleep. And if you're wanting to use it as a hypnotic, you use a higher dose and you use it like closer to bedtime. But it's also a chronotrope, meaning it helps set your circadian clock, your rhythm. And when you're wanting to use it in that way, such as like a teenager with delayed sleep phase syndrome, one uses a much lower dose and uses it hours before bedtime. Another thing to know about melatonin is when folks have studied different preparations and even the same preparation from one batch to the other, it's very unreliable. The quality control is just not there because these products in the United States are not regulated. So the one batch of a certain brand might have 8 times more or less of a given dose of melatonin. And this just came across my email box this week. The past few years, there's been an increasing number of melatonin overdoses. And thankfully, most of them just lead to prolonged sleepiness, but a couple of kids have actually gotten quite sick with it. So important to recall that melatonin is not a gummy bear. It's not a vitamin, and it, like any medicine, needs to be kept out of reach. It's not recommended ever for use under 3 years of age. And if one is thinking about using it to help with their child's sleep, it always has to be used with combined with behavioral strategies. So that's my Sleep 101. Any questions before we talk about infants and toddlers?
Feel free to put in your chat, in the chat, or if you prefer, just if you can raise your hand, I can do that. Thank you, Wendy. I think it was a great foundation, I think, for us to understand what I think most parents, I suspect, are interested in is what do we do when our child is having troubles with sleep?
Yeah.
But in order to really understand that and be able to follow through with that kind of recommendation, which I know you're getting to, we really have to understand what sleep is and why it's important and how it's what's happening in our brains. So thank you for that review. I always learn something from you. That's great.
Thanks, John. Yeah, and it's important. I sometimes I feel when I'm giving this presentation like this, like that folks might feel I'm off topic, but I think the knowledge is power, and it's really important to understand, the function of sleep and the mechanisms to know where your control lies as well. So
Great. So I don't see any other questions right now.
Okay.
So why don't we go ahead with the the practical aspects of how we can put this to use.
Perfect. Great. So there never was a child so lovely, but his mother or father was glad to get him or her to sleep. Ralph Waldo Emerson. So how much sleep is enough is always a question that comes up. And it's a difficult one to answer because there's a great deal of variation from one individual to another to how much sleep a person needs. And then across the lifespan, it's constantly changing as well. But generally speaking, a newborn is going to need 17 plus hours, and then infants 13 to 16, and then toddlers 11 to 14, and then decreasing from there. But this is sleep needs in 24 hours. The variation from one individual to another is greatest in infancy and toddlers. So here's a 1-month-old, here's a 60-month-old or a 5-year-old. You can see there's a great deal of variation from how much infants sleep from one infant to another at a month, but then all of that gets tightened up by 5 years of age. This is hopefully a hopeful slide. So here is daytime sleep, here's nighttime sleep. Here's 1 week, kind of 50-50. And then here's 6 months, getting much less sleep during the day and much more sleep at night. And then on to 3 years, where around three or four, most kids are giving up their nap. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on newborns since we don't have any newborns present. But just to say, one of the interesting things about the biological clock, and I neglected to mention this, is that the whole clock doesn't develop until an infant is about 3 months old. So back here, a 1-week-old does not have a biological clock. They literally don't know the difference between day and night. And that's because it's really, they have to feed, right? So that a newborn at the most, you're going to get like a 3 or 4 hour stretch of sleep out of them. But otherwise, they're going to be, they're going to be up maybe for 50 minutes and then sleeping for 50 minutes, rinse and repeat. But the need to feed and grow really sets sleep-wake in a newborn. Where around 3 months of age, it's thought that the biological clock is fully or almost fully online. So around 3 months of age, infants will start knowing the difference between day and night. And it's really important for us to work with that. So at that age, one of the aspects of sleep training or encouraging healthy sleep would be to have a really set wake time, because that's what's going to set the biological clock and set one up for better nighttime sleep. But anyway, so developmentally in a newborn, sleep-wake cycles are really dependent upon hunger and feeding. Circadian rhythms and environmental clues like family activity play much less of a role in their sleep. So at this age, it's important to know a couple of different things. So it's important to recognize signs of sleepiness in an infant that might be yawning, irritability, fussing, crying, eye rubbing. And if one waits till the infant gets overtired, it might actually be harder to get them down. Babies, as I mentioned, infants, newborns enter sleep through REM. So there may be some grimacing and smiling and twitching that happens just as they're falling asleep. And then sleep environment. I won't spend a lot of time on safe sleep, but a bassinet, crib, co-sleeper. And generally, I think it's good to make that transition from a bassinet to a crib before 3 months of age. I'm going to skip over safe sleep, except to say, I endorse what the AAP and the CDC have to say, that it's really important that we put babies to sleep on their backs at night and for all nap times, firm surface, nothing loose in the crib.
Can I ask you a question? Somebody asked a question of why transitioning to a crib at 3 months of age. Why is that important?
So that has to do with sleep onset associations. So we really want, so at 3 months of age, babies are really, so the circadian rhythms are coming on board, the biological clock is coming on board, but also other learning that relates to sleep. And so you really want your infant sleeping in the same place for all sleep episodes so that they come to associate that space with sleep. Crib equals sleep, crib equals sleep, crib equals sleep. So I think if you can make that transition around 3 months, that's just an opportune time before they get too big to be in the bassinet, and that they then learn to sleep in their crib, that's their sleep space. And that as much as possible, and this is, not a perfect world, but if it were a perfect world, the infant would always sleep in that same space. So for during the night and for naps, so that they develop a really strong association in the brain and the body that this is where sleep happens. So, but that does bring me to this topic of sleep onset associations, which is really important for infants, but also toddlers, and for all of us, honestly. But sleep onset associations refer to the conditions that are present under which an infant has learned to sleep. And then they require them, they're conditioned to fall to sleep with those same conditions. So that might mean rocking, feeding, sucking, right? And so if one is always feeding and rocking their infant to sleep at 3, 4, 5, 6 months old, then following a normal overnight arousal, which we know is going to happen, right, every 50 to 60 minutes, that infant may expect to be rocked, fed back to sleep. So it's really helpful around 3 months to 4 months of age to really start putting the baby to bed sleepy, but not sound asleep. So it's, and this takes patience and practice and persistence, but the best that one can, it's to set somebody up for successful sleep in the second half of the first year, to really start around 3 to 4 months of age to get the baby to bed sleepy, but not sound asleep. And sometimes it can be helpful to actually move the feeding up a little bit in the bedtime routine. So maybe nurse or bottle feed first, and then rock and cuddle and read a book, because not too early to start reading at 3 or 4 months, looking at a book together, and then put the baby down. so that one isn't developing an association between, oh, I only know how to fall asleep being breastfed or being bottle fed or being rocked, until I'm into stage N3 sleep, and then you can put me down. And in the sleep world, we talk about self-soothers. So those are the infants that soothe themselves back to sleep without signaling for parents after normal overnight arousals. And the self-soother will typically have very brief arousals that a parent might even know about. And the ability to self-soothe is absolutely associated with being put to bed drowsy but not asleep. And signalers, on the other hand, may alert parents following normal overnight arousals by crying. And then parents get to decide how they respond and how quickly, right? And I usually recommend, especially after 3 to 4 months of age, not running in when or responding to the infant immediately after a normal overnight arousal. Some infants will wedge and whine and fuss and make little noises for 10, 15, 20 minutes and then settle back to sleep. So I'm not saying let a baby that age cry, but I am saying just give them a little bit of space to see if they can figure out how to settle themselves back to sleep. And if on the other hand, one responds immediately, and if the response is really social or involve feeding, then what can happen is you're actually reinforcing that signaling behavior. And then that can lead to what's called trained night crying or trained night feeder. And that can be a hard cycle to break. So one of the most important points I can share for anyone with a 3 or 4 month old infant, if their goal is to have them sleep independently through the night, would be to not respond too quickly to normal overnight arousals. Just recall that it's normal, give them a little bit of space to figure out how to settle themselves back to sleep. And that may take, 10, 15 minutes, and that can be hard. I can remember lying in bed, hearing one of the kids rouse, thinking, oh, I might as well get up and nurse him so we can all get back to sleep. But in fact, that really might reinforce the waking and signaling behavior. A word about pacifiers. I don't know about you, John, but in my experience as a pediatrician, I have found that the concern about pacifiers and breastfeeding is overrated. I find that most babies know the difference between the breast and a pacifier, and also that babies have a really strong need to suck that can go above and beyond what they need for nutrition. It's one of the few ways they can settle themselves, they can soothe themselves. So I'm a fan of pacifiers to help with sleep. There's some evidence that they are somehow protective against sudden infant death or sudden unexplained death, we're calling it now. The challenge with pacifiers is that it can become a sleep onset association that requires a parent to be present. My husband used to talk about rebinking. And usually, however, about 6 to 8 months, most infants will be able to find the pacifier in their crib. One of our kids ended up with about 8 of them in the crib, and then she was certain to find one in the middle of the night. But I do think it's important to, in older infants and toddlers, to really limit the pacifier to the crib. So it's just there for bedtime and napping. Otherwise, they end up with that binky talk that no one can understand, right? So moving on to 3-month-olds, I think I've already really covered this, but the developmental issue here is that the biological clock has really developed. 3-month-olds have really developed day-night cycles. Most of their sleep occurs at night. They're going to have typically 3 naps, a mid-morning nap, a mid-afternoon nap, and then maybe a late afternoon or early evening power nap. And there's a real opportunity here to set the clock with a regular schedule of waking, feeding, and early morning light exposure. And on the other end of the day, dark and quiet evenings. And just to reiterate that the ability to fall asleep and return to sleep is a learned developmental skill, just like learning to walk, learning to talk. This is something that that infants learn to do, and we can encourage that learning by taking a wait and see approach for overnight arousals and doing the best that we can to put them down sleepy but not asleep, and also to have a really soothing bedtime routine. 6-month-olds, they'll be sleeping less during the day, more at night. They frequently drop that afternoon, late afternoon or evening power nap. Firmly develop biological clock. Really important to keep a set schedule, the best that you can, 7 days a week. At 6 months, most infants no longer need to feed from a physiologic point of view. And I don't like to give this as a blanket because every infant is different. And if you want to drop, nighttime feedings altogether, I think it's important to discuss that with your pediatrician and make that decision together, especially if there's been a concern about growth. But as a broadly speaking, most 6-month-olds no longer physiologically need to feed at night, but they might be trained to feed at night. And that can be challenging to deal with. And the way to deal with it is to make the feedings, if they're still happening overnight, shorter. Really keep track of how much they're feeding and make them shorter and shorter and shorter, and then eventually start dropping the feed. And then developmental issues can really sometimes wreak havoc with 6 and 9-month-old infants, especially when they're crawling and they learn to pull to stand. That's pretty exciting stuff. And like, who wants to go to sleep when you just figured out how to crawl, right? I mean, and also they might learn how to pull up on the side of the crib, but then not know how to get themselves back down. So that might be something that you have to work on during the day. Teach your child to pull up on the coffee table, but then work on that skill of getting themselves back down. Bedtime routines are, I touched on briefly, but really important and for infants and toddlers. And they help a child have a sense of order, rhythm, control. They know what's going to come next when they have a regular night-to-night bedtime routine. And actually, bedtime routines have been shown to help a child become sleepy because they know what's coming next. It's good to have a bedtime routine starting around 3 months of age, have it be consistent and pleasant. And families that, for infants for whom there has been a bedtime routine, it's been shown to reduce the sleep onset difficulties and also reduce problems with overnight awakenings. And it's good to include calm activities such as feeding, bathing, rocking. Massage, I think, is underused. Reading, lullaby. As I mentioned, it can be good to have the feeding earlier in the bedtime routine so that a baby doesn't come to associate feeding with falling asleep. And always good to have the last steps of the routine happen where the infant or toddler will sleep. Again, you want them to start developing those sleep onset associations in their sleep space. And it can be helpful to have shorter routines for napping.
Wendy, I want to make sure you get to this because I know you will, because we have a couple questions about, okay, we have a toddler and we didn't necessarily do these things. Now what do we do? I'm sure you'll get to that, right?
Well, let's just get to it, okay? Because I think we're here's toddlers. I think the bedtime routine is really important. The wake time is really important. So making sure that the child has a set wake times nearly 7 days a week. No weekend oversleep, because that's going to really interfere with the biological clock and then the child's ability to fall asleep at a certain time. So before thinking about any type of sleep training, if you will, I think it's really important to start by having a set schedule, or within reason, the best that you can given all your obligations. So have a set schedule for wake time, for meals, and for naps. And then with the toddler, you do have to be aware that the naps aren't too long or too late, because that's going to interfere with sleep onset. Again, I mentioned the toddler who falls asleep, in the car ride home from daycare. So if you have all of those things in place, then it really depends upon what the problem is. Is it, maybe we could open it up, John, or I'd like to hear some more specifics in order to answer that question.
Sure. Yeah.
Or for
Jen, do
instance,
you feel comfortable maybe asking a question about about a toddler that is having trouble? Probably, my guess would be, I'll tell you what I hear a lot of, and you let me know. They have some trouble getting to sleep, and then about 3 or 4 hours later, they wake up and they're crying. But Jen, is there anybody in the audience who would feel comfortable sharing that experience specifically? And we can turn off the recording if that's more comfortable. Maybe we can they unmute themselves if you'd like, if that's easier? Let me see.
Well, while we're waiting, John, I can just say, it's important if somebody is having problems with signaling overnight.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry, Greta, excuse me, Greta has her hand up.
Perfect.
Can they unmute themselves? Yeah, go ahead. Is that all right, Wendy? Go ahead, Greta.
Oh, yeah, please, go right. Yeah, let's go for it.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Sure.
So my toddler is 16 months old, and she had trouble sleeping from the get-go, and I tried everything I could think of, and just to save my sanity, ended up just nursing her to sleep. So we've created this awful dynamic where she just nurses a lot overnight.
Mhm.
But we've had some success recently where I'll nurse her and then rock her to sleep. And so overnight nursing has decreased considerable. Like it's amazing how much it's decreased. But mainly I'm having trouble getting her to sleep at night. So talking like 2 hours of her trying to fall asleep. So then she'll fall asleep around 9. And if I'm supposed to wake her up in the morning, like I feel super guilty. Like I don't want to wake her up at 6 in the morning when I knew that she fell asleep at 9 at night. And then sometimes she'll wake up in the middle of the night and I just cannot get her back down. It's really difficult. It's like 2 hours in the middle of the night trying to get her back down.
So how much, let me ask you, thank you for the question. So how much does her wake time, wake and out of bed time vary day to day? Like the earliest she's up and out of bed, in a given week, and the latest she's up and out of bed in a given week. And this is judgment-free zone.
Yeah. And so the earliest, so there's some outliers where it would be like 5:30, but I'd say mainly the earliest would be 6.
Mhm.
And then the latest is around 8.
Yeah. So honestly, the place to start is by setting her wake time. Okay. Really 7 days a week. So, and I know that that's hard, right? Because she's maybe not getting enough sleep. So you want her to get those extra 2 hours, right? That difference between 6 and 8. But that's also giving her what we call social jet lag. So she's constantly traveling between time zones, right? Sometimes she's on the East Coast, sometimes she's heading towards the West Coast, and her biological clock can't get set anywhere. And then the days when she sleeps later, it's going to be harder for her to go to bed she's going to be up a certain number of hours to have enough sleep drive to be able to fall asleep at a set time. And so the way to the place to start, and I understand it could be painful, is to really just kind of look at your life and your schedule and your obligations, and to pick a wake time for her and stick to it as a place to start. Because I don't think things are going to get, her sleep schedule isn't going to get straightened out. And it's also going to lead to that, sometimes 2 hours to fall asleep at night and then awake 2 hours in the middle of the night. You really have to set her clock. So that's one thing. And then the best that you can have set meals and nap time during the day. And it's brilliant what you've done about moving the nursing up in her bedtime routine. That's really helpful. And so if you can nurse her and then have that rocking and cuddle time, and then get her to put her down to her bed sleepy but not asleep, that will be helpful. Is she co-sleeping with you, so she has easy access to nurse overnight, or if I may?
Not now. We've been setting some boundaries on that. She was before. She was nursing like 4 or 5 hours straight at night because I just couldn't handle it. I was so sleep deprived.
Yeah.
But one of our new boundaries is that she stays in her room even when she wakes in the middle of the night and I have to go comfort her. I'm trying to stay in her room. And I guess that was another question is, I guess that's probably super important to stay in there even when I'm in there comforting her, so she knows that she needs to stay in her room.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, so one way that you could go with this would be to do some, what people refer to as sleep training. And why don't we just talk about that for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, and maybe Wendy, somebody asked another question, which I think is going to get to that. Also, this is a 34-month-old who wakes up at the same time in mornings, usually 7:30, and falls asleep at night I'm misreading. Falls asleep easily at night with the bottle and wakes up at night asking for a bottle, usually 2 times per night, no longer naps. We would like to end the nighttime feedings.
Right. Yeah. So, so a couple things. What you would, for the feedings at night, what I would start by doing is keeping track of how much they're getting. So at the pre-bedtime bottle, and then the bottles in the middle of the night. And then I would start by making the bottles in the middle of the night less. So let's just say, to throw a number out, that they're getting 3 ounces twice, right, during the overnight, and maybe 3 ounces at the beginning of the night. I would start taking like 1/2 ounce to 1 ounce away once a week, so that the most that they're getting at a given feeding is 2 ounces. And then the next week, make the most that they're getting at a given feeding is 1 ounce. Then after that, I would discontinue it altogether. And also recall, this is where it's important to recall that waking overnight is normal. So for neither of these infants or toddlers is the difficulty that they wake overnight. It's the difficulty is how they've learned how to fall asleep. So you have to redo that learning, which is absolutely positive, possible. We all learn new things all the time, right? We always do. We're always learning new things. But the longer you wait to intervene, the harder it can be, because the groove just gets deeper and deeper and deeper, right? It's like the wagon wheels going down a rut in a road. The longer you wait to intervene, the deeper those ruts can get. So a couple of things that would apply to both of these children would be, one, the best that you can to remove the feeding from the bedtime routine, the immediate bedtime routine. So make it earlier. So maybe even do the feeding and then bath if they're doing a bath at night, or certainly feeding and then rocking and then reading, or lullaby, and then putting to bed sleepy but not asleep. And then if you wanted to think about, and I don't like to do sleep training until I know the circadian clock is set, and also that the child isn't getting significant nutrition overnight. Because if a child, so I think it's good to get rid of the overnight feedings and at least decrease the, if it's bottle feeding, decrease the amount that they're getting at each feeding. And if it's nursing, decrease the amount of time that they're nursing each feeding. So it can be helpful to minimize that first, because if a child's really kind of trained or accustomed to be hungry overnight, it's going to be hard for them to go back to sleep, right? We don't want that. So I think addressing the amount that they're feeding overnight after setting their clock, moving the feeding up earlier in the nighttime routine, and then you can launch into some type of sleep training. And the way that one would do that would be to have the feeding, have the bedtime routine, put the child down to bed or crib sleepy but not asleep, and then leave the room. And then if your goal is for them to be able to sleep independently. So again, this all depends upon your goals. And I always like to touch bases on what someone's goals are before I go further. But making the assumption that you want your child to sleep independently, you would then leave the room. And they're likely to say, what's up? This isn't the gig, right? This isn't you're changing the rules on me, right? So they'll likely cry. And then you can wait a while, and you can go in and say, it's sleeping time. I love you. I'll see you in the morning. And then you leave the room. And then maybe they cry even louder and longer, because this really is not the game we've been playing, right, for 13 or 34 months, right? These rules are all different, and they are, right? You're setting new boundaries, you're setting a new routine, because you've come, you respect the importance of sleep for you and for your toddler. So this can continue for usually 45 minutes, maybe an hour, sometimes 2 hours the first night, where the infant will cry or toddler will cry, and you go in calmly, patiently, just reassure them with your presence. It's sleeping time. I love you. I'll see you in the morning. And then you leave. So typically the first night, if one were to choose this route, the first night of crying, fussing, disruption can be a couple of hours at the most. Usually the second night it's worse. It's called the extinction burst. Oftentimes the behavior gets worse before it gets better. And then by the third or fourth night, they're starting to figure it out. And they're starting to figure out how to settle and soothe themselves to sleep. And generally speaking, once they learn how to fall asleep on their own at the beginning of the night, then that skill generalizes to being able to return to sleep following normal overnight arousals that happen later. But the sleep can get worse before it gets better. So I don't encourage folks to think about doing this type of approach until they're really ready to do it. Like they feel like they have the resources and the reserve, the bandwidth to do it. And also I don't encourage somebody trying this if, what you don't want to do is say, okay, we're going to dig down deep. We're going to do this sleep training. The gig's up. We have to do this. It's so important for all of us. You don't want to start this path, go down this path, and then after an hour and a half, pick the child up, nurse them, or bring them into your bed or whatever. Because what you've just taught them, oh, well, I guess crying 20 minutes wasn't it? Crying 30 minutes wasn't it? But crying an hour and a half, that's the sweet spot. That's when I'm gonna, I'm gonna get what I'm looking for. So it's important not to go down this path until you feel really committed to it. And that's gonna vary. So
Wendy, can I ask there's another
Sure.
question here about
Yeah.
similar, but has some different nuance. And that is,
Yeah.
I have a 17-month-old and I nurse him to sleep and also co-sleeping. Is it too late to try sleep training? I tried Ferber method, but he stands and cries in his crib. So what to do if he keeps standing and crying, and how long can I wait to soothe him?
Right. So, and I'm sorry, is he still nursing to sleep overnight?
Yes,
And
yes.
does he nurse over during the
And
overnight?
co-sleeping too.
Yeah. So
I think so. I think, yes, right. Yes. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. So first you have to cut down on the overnight nursing, which is really hard if you're co-sleeping. It's almost impossible. So good job to get them into the crib, right? But again, you have to cut down the amount that they're nursing at night so that it's there, that they truly aren't hungry at night. And typically they aren't, often it's just that the typical history will be somebody that just nurses for a minute or two, right? And then they return promptly to sleep. So that's not somebody that's getting significant nutrition. That sounds like somebody who's just learned how to fall asleep nursing. So I think moving them into the crib is if you're wanting to discontinue the co-sleeping, that's great, and it's hard. And I commend you for taking that step because these things are really hard. And just to share, these are patterns and habits that we all fall into just trying to do our best, right? We're just trying to get through the day, right? And so we need the nights to go a little better. So again, it's a judgment-free zone. But it's in terms of how long to let a child fuss. I know of no data that says that you need to stop at an hour, you need to stop at 2 hours, you need to stop at 3. And there's been a significant amount of research looking at sleep training. And what we know is that, yes, boy, it's a hard week or two. It's really hard to do this. And it's one of those things that's simple, but it's not easy. The long-term effects are fabulous. Children learn to sleep on their own. There's no problems with attachment. There's no problems with parent-child relationship. And it's something that one can do with a great deal of confidence that they're really, in the long run, helping their child become a better sleeper, a good sleeper, which has lifelong effects. And we do know that children that don't have sleep concerns addressed in infancy and toddlers do end up having more sleep problems as older children, and more behavioral problems. So it's an investment. It's a hard one, but it's really an investment, and it's perfectly safe. There's no detrimental psychological effects. But and in some ways, it's almost harder on us caregivers, right? It's really hard. It's really hard to listen to a child cry.
Yeah, and this is generally with parenting, I tell parents to go with their instincts, but there are a few exceptions, and this is one of them, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, all of our parental instincts is to soothe a crying child. I mean, it's what we're built to do, I guess, in there. But in certain circumstances, I think it's actually not the right thing to do at certain times, and this might be one of them. I think it is.
Yeah, I agree completely, John. And it is so hard, right? And again, I think it's important to point out that people get into these habits just because they're trying to get a good night's sleep. There's older kids that, they don't want woken up, or, they're really feeling the effects of not good sleep on their own mental and physical health during the day. But, a sleep training approach can make a huge difference for the whole family, being short on sleep is a real setup for anxiety, depression, moodiness, right? Not being a great parent the next day. It's hard to bring your A game to parenting if you yourself aren't getting good sleep. So.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? Another common question is, I'll just read it. I'm not sure how I feel about sleep training, so I'm currently staying in her room, not talking to her and waiting for her to fall asleep. That can take a long time, but she's calmer and not crying, which is what I feel more comfortable with. Do you think my presence is making it harder for her to fall asleep?
So that's a great question. And I would call, so sleep training is no one thing, right? There's different approaches to sleep training. And one of them is sleep training with parental presence. So I mentioned, putting the child down to bed sleepy, but not asleep, and then leaving the room. That's one way of doing sleep training. Another is to stay in the room until the child falls asleep. And it depends upon the parent and the child, which they're more comfortable with. So the staying in the room, so sleep training with parental presence, it's called, is fine, and it can be really effective. It takes longer. But if that's what is comfortable if that's what's comfortable for somebody, then that's the thing for them to do. That's what they're comfortable with. Just know that it does tend to take longer. And the important thing then is to just, the best that you can, minimize your interaction. You might want to stay in the room with your back towards the crib. And then once they learn to fall asleep with you there, without, being held or rocked or fed, then you can start moving your chair further and further from the crib, and then maybe out into the hall, and then eventually down the hall. And then eventually, they're able to fall asleep on their own without you there at all. Another kind of variant of that, and there are many variants. And so when I'm working with a family, I like to know what their goals are, and then 2, what their tolerance is, and 3, what they've tried before and how it went. And but another thing that you can do for older kids is called the I'll be right back method. So you've got them down into their bed or their crib after their bedtime routine, and you'll say, oh, this can be good for toddlers or older preschoolers. You know what? I forgot to turn the dishwasher on. I'll be right back. Right? So you leave the bedroom, you go put the dishwasher on or do whatever, and then you do come right back. You always come right back. Oh, I forgot to blah, blah, blah. So you go do that thing and then you come back. And each time you leave the room, you make your absence just a little bit longer. So maybe you're gone for 1 minute, then maybe you're gone for 2 minutes, then maybe you're gone for 3, 4, 5, you get the picture. But during one of those times, your child will, in all likelihood, fall asleep on their own. And then once they've done that, then that success can transfer to to subsequent nights, but also to normal overnight arousals. So that can be another way, particularly for an older, more verbal child who's going to get that notion of, oh, I have to go do something and I'll be right back.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a little over 5 minutes now. And do you want, was there more specific things that you wanted to make sure that we cover? Or I'm going to ask if there are any other questions. So why don't you go ahead and I'll interrupt you if I get any more questions.
So I am also a fan of transitional objects. And so here's Linus, right, with his blanket and his thumb, right? He just looks like the baby Buddha to me, right?
Mhm.
He's really learned how to calm himself. And I think for, for toddlers where it's safe for them to have a transitional object in the crib, so this would be over a year of age, blankets, a lovey, a stuffed animal can be really, really helpful to have them make that transition from being awake to asleep. If you are to use a transitional object, I recommend having a few of them. So like having, 2 bunnies so that one can be in the wash or one can get left to daycare or, whatever, so that you always have one available. I recommend, if you're going to try to encourage a transitional object, that you use it during all soothing moments during the day. So they fall and they, bump their head, you pick them up, you pick up the bunny and you snuggle and you comfort with them all together so that they really come to associate the stuffed animal or the blanket with comforting. If they're using a transitional object, make it definitely part of the bedtime routine. right? So it's going to be part of the rocking and reading, book reading, all of that. Some kids will even like it, they'll get in the habit of like taking like a blanket and stroking their face, or like an animal's ear and stroking their face with it. And you can encourage that. So when you're rocking with the bedtime routine. But so transitional objects can be really helpful. And then I just have here also, just to be sure that TV and electronics are not part of the bedtime routine. Then maybe it's worth just talking about this for a moment. So bedtime problems are no different than any other behavioral concern. And they respond to similar strategies. So always using, positive reinforcement to increase behavior that you're looking for. Avoid punishment always. Focus on increasing positive behaviors. Be consistent, and that's really hard, especially when it comes to sleep, the consistency. The consistency of the wake time, the consistency in the bedtime routine, consistency in being put to bed sleepy but not asleep. And then for older kids, where it's appropriate, you can give them a little bit of choice. Do you want to go to bed now or in 5 minutes? Right? Give them a little bit of a sense of control, but you're still really in charge of what the choices are. And then we will be able to share a handout. There's a book that might interest you folks. It's for the older kids. It's Never Too Late to Sleep Train. So it's never too late. And this is written by Craig Canaperi. He's in sleep medicine at Yale. That's a great book. My favorite book is Sleeping Through the Night for Infants and Toddlers by Jody Mindell. And then she has a follow-up book that she wrote with Judy Owens, Take Charge of Your Child's Sleep. These two are really my go-to people, Jody Mindell and Judy Owens. And then just a website that is maintained by Jody Mindell is called babysleep.com. I highly recommend folks look at this. It talks about different sleep during all the different developmental stages from birth to about 3, but you can also search it by problem, like night feeding or sleep onset, or fill in the blank. But that's a really great resource. And then just for adult learning about sleep, I like Russell Foster and Matthew Walker. So I'm happy to take more questions if folks have any.
We do have one more. I'll read it. First of all, Greta says, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. One more question. Our toddler's wake windows are very different. So she takes her nap around 3 hours after she wakes in the morning, but is then awake for 6 to 7 hours before bedtime. Should I make those wake windows more even?
So that sounds, and how long will the nap be? So
her nap around 3 hours. She takes her nap around, no, I'm sorry, that's 3 hours after she wakes in the morning. It doesn't say.
Yeah, I would kind of wonder if that's somebody who isn't getting enough
2 hours, 2 hours nap.
2 hour nap. If it works for you and they're not having problems falling asleep at night, that sounds fine to me. It sounds like if it's not broken, don't fix it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yep. And thank Wendy. Do you want to talk? I do want you to. I would like people to know that there are options for more personal care and questions and services. Wendy has now a private practice that she does, and here's a slide of the types of services that she can provide if you need further guidance. There's one more thing she has.
Sure.
Greta says she has significant problems falling asleep. Oh, this is a follow-up just on that last one. Okay. I think maybe she's saying she's having significant problems falling asleep at night. So maybe the question is that is she either napping too much or is the nap too close? Well, it's in the morning, I gather. So it's not too close to her bedtime.
And her wake time is pretty set?
I will assume so.
Yeah.
So maybe.
Yeah, I would probably, what I would do is keep a sleep diary and see if you can't tease out what's going on. It can be a really helpful tool where you just, and if you Google sleep diaries, and I can send one to NAP so that you have an example of what one might look like. But the ones for a situation like this that I really like, you shade in the sleep period. So you're shading in, at nap time and then bedtime, and then you're looking at it for about a week or two, and really doing the best that you can. Some pattern might emerge by doing that that you might not kind of otherwise pick up. Just kind of trying to keep track of things day to day. So that would be one thing I would recommend doing, is keeping a sleep diary to see if there isn't something going on. One thing that kind of comes up for me hearing that a toddler is up for 3 hours and is ready for a nap, I'm a little concerned maybe they aren't getting enough sleep at night. But I would really want, if they're up 3 hours and already need a nap, that kind of suggests to me that maybe they aren't getting enough sleep at night. But again, if I was working with that person individually, I would really want to look at a sleep diary so that I was making recommendations based on data, from that child.
Sure. Great. Well, thanks again, Wendy. I really do appreciate you coming to NAP here. Sure. NAP, what a great name. And giving us some lots of things to think about and to do. And these slides in this presentation will be on our website, I believe. So if people want to refer back to those slides that you had about resources and about your contact information, they'll be able to do that. Perfect. I thank everybody for attending. And have a lovely evening. And I wish you all the best, everybody, with your kids. And I hope you all get a good night's sleep.
Okay, great. Good night. Bye, everybody. Take care.
Thanks again, Wendy. That was terrific. Welcome. Just great. I love listening to you talk, and I learned something. As I said, this adenosine thing is really interesting to me.